I told them not to touch the humans, and they laughed at me. You have to understand what that laughter meant, coming from where it came from. I am Vayan, of the Osei, and my rank in the Concord was low enough that most officers never bothered to learn my name. I read patterns. I read the long, slow shapes of things, the way a species behaves under pressure, the way a fleet moves when it thinks no one is measuring. On the day I stood before Grand Marshal Karth Vale and the assembled staff of the flagship, I had one thing to say, and I said it plainly. Do not provoke the last of them. Do not sign the Ash Protocol. Let the human ships pass out of our space and forget they were ever here. Vael did not even turn his full body toward me. He was Keruvani, old, scaled in the deep gray that only the oldest of them wear, and he had never lost a battle in 400 cycles of war. He looked at me the way you look at weather. A species that loses its cradle has lost its spine, he said. That was the whole of his answer. A species that loses its cradle has lost its spine. The room made the soft, rippling sound that Ceruvani make instead of laughing, and I felt the heat go out of my chest, and I sat back down, and I began to count. I counted the first silence that day. A trade beacon on the rim of Kalis space had gone dark 11 hours earlier, and no one had noticed but me. One silence. I wrote it down. I did not know yet that I was starting a ledger that would outlast the Concord itself. Here is what everyone in that room already knew and had already decided not to feel. The humans had come to us broken. Their cradle world had burned. Not by our hand, we were always careful to say, but by the Cheruvani. In the years when the Concord still called the Ceruvani a member in good standing and the humans a genetic hazard to be quarantined. We watched their sky come down. We heard their envoy beg for a single ruling, one line of law that would name the burning a crime. And we voted to table the question. We called them volatile. We expelled their delegation for raising their voices in a chamber built on marble and 300 species of restraint. And then we told ourselves the matter was closed, because the ones who might have argued were now Ash, and Ash does not petition. I want to be honest about my own part in it, because the story is worthless if I am not. I sat in that chamber during the vote to expel the human envoy. I was junior then, an analyst with no standing, and I said nothing. I watched a woman with gray at her temples stand in the well of the chamber and ask 300 species to simply name a fire, and I watched 300 species look away, and I looked away with them. I have thought about that woman every day since. I do not know her name. She was gone by the next cycle, expelled, and then Colas burned, and I told myself, the way we all told ourselves, that it was a tragedy and not a decision. It was a decision. Every silence is a decision. That is the first thing the humans taught me, though they never said a word of it to my face. So when a single human ship crossed into the approaches of Halvane, the Concord's own seat, and did not fire, did not hail, did not demand anything at all, Vile read it as the last twitch of a dying animal. I read it differently. I had spent 6 years reading them, and the one thing I had learned was this. When a human is quiet, it is not because he has nothing left. It is because he has already decided, and the deciding is over. The ship was called the Iron Vigil. I had her lines committed to memory. She was not large. She carried no visible weapon banks, no crusader markings, no boast. She simply held her position above our outer ring, engines idling, patient as a stone in a river, while 40 of our interceptors formed a cage around her and waited for the order to close it. On the bridge of Vale's flagship, no one spoke above a murmur. The Grand Marshal stood with his hands folded behind him and watched the single human vessel, the way a hunter watches a wounded thing that has stopped running, which is to say, with contempt and a small, buried unease he would never have named. I stood at my station 3 tiers down, and I watched the same ship and felt only the unease. None of the contempt, because I had read her lines and I knew that a ship built like that, stripped of every ornament, carrying nothing she did not need, was not the ship of a desperate people. It was the ship of a patient one. Desperation decorates. Patience strips down. Her commander opened one channel. Not to the Concord. To us, the flagship, to Viel specifically, which meant someone aboard that ship knew exactly who Viel was and had chosen him. His name was Adaro, Commander Ren Adaro. His voice, when it came through, was the calmest thing I have ever heard. Cross a war frequency. He did not threaten. He said only that he had come to return something, and that we should watch the third moon of Halvane in 6 hours, and that after that we would understand him better. Then he closed the channel. Viel ordered the interceptors to fire. They fired. I watched the readouts, and I want to tell you what actually happened, because the reports afterward lied about it, and I will not. The human ship did not raise a shield. She did something to the space around herself, some quiet trick of the field that our instruments could not name, and every round we threw simply went elsewhere. Not blocked, not absorbed, elsewhere, as if she had asked the physics of the moment for a small favor, and been granted it. 40 interceptors emptied their magazines into a volume of space, and the Iron Vigil sat inside that volume, untouched, unbothered, and did not fire back. That was the first flex. It changed nothing in Viel's face. But I saw 2 of the younger officers stop breathing for a moment, and I understood that they had felt what I felt, which was the specific cold that comes when a thing you believe to be true turns out to be a thing you merely hoped. One of them, a Cheruvani lieutenant named Sevith, who I will mention again, murmured a single question into the hush. "Marshal, why did she not shoot back?" And Viel said, "Because she cannot," and everyone on that bridge wanted to believe him, and I watched the want move through the room like a current, and I did not believe him. And I was alone in that, as I would be alone in it for a long time. 6 hours later, the third moon of Halvane lit up along one edge, a soft, even line of light, and when it faded, there was a single word carved a kilometer deep into the regolith, in a script no Concord machine had ever catalogued. Torvek translated it for us later, and I will come to Torvek. The word was mercy. They had spent their one demonstration writing the word mercy on our moon, and then they had left. I sat in my quarters that night and I looked at my ledger. 2 entries now. The first silence, and a single ship that had asked our weapons to miss and been obeyed. I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that comes right before a life turns over, that Viel had it exactly backward. A species does not lose its spine when its cradle burns. A species learns in that fire precisely what it is willing to become, and then it becomes it quietly and comes to find you. I did not sleep. I counted. The second silence came 4 days after the moon. A Concord relay station in the Dreven corridor stopped answering. Then a Cheruvani supply depot. Then a customs platform that had, in the years of the burning, sold human refugee coordinates to the highest bidder and called it lawful commerce. None of them were destroyed. That was the part no one could hold in their heads. When we finally reached the Dreven relay, we found it intact, powered, every system online and completely empty of the manifests, the transponder codes, the routing keys that made it useful. The humans had not blown it up. They had reached inside it and taken its memory gently and left the body standing so that we would have to keep looking at it. Viel called it sabotage. I called it a message, and I was right. Though being right in the Concord was a kind of loneliness I had not yet learned to bear. I flagged the pattern for the staff. The humans were not striking military targets. They were striking the quiet machinery that had kept the burning running, the fuel that fed the fleets that melted human oceans, the ledgers that hid the sale of human children, the engines that no one thought counted, because no one who ran them ever held a weapon. Human justice, I wrote in my report, does not measure intent. It measures consequence. A hand that fuels a fire is a hand that set it. I sent the report up the chain, and it was returned to me unread, with a note that my speculation exceeded my clearance. I went to Sevith, the young lieutenant, because he had asked the right question on the bridge, and I thought perhaps he could be reached. I showed him the pattern, the way the human strikes traced the exact supply lines of the Colis burning, node by node, as if someone had laid a map of the crime over the map of the galaxy and was walking it, calmly, in order. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "So they are not raiding." They are answering. And I said, yes. And he said, how far down the list will they go? And I said, all the way. And he did not argue. And I saw in his face the beginning of the fear that would eventually save his life. Because the officers who felt that fear early were the ones who learned later, when it mattered, to keep their hands very still. They gave us a chance to make it worse, and we took it, the way we always did. The Concord authorized a punitive fleet, not against the Iron Vigil, which we could not catch, but against the human colonies we could still find. The scattered survivor settlements clinging to dead rocks along the far rim. 9 ships. Cheruvani cruisers, the pride of Viel's old command, sent to remind the humans of their proper size. I watched them jump out. I counted them as they went. 9. I wrote it in the ledger, with a steadiness I did not feel, because some part of me already knew what the ledger would say when they came back. They did not come back. There was no battle. There was no distress call. There was, at the appointed hour, simply an absence where 9 ships should have reported in, and then a single transmission on an open channel that anyone in Concord space could hear if they tuned to it. It was Adaro's voice again, and it was not gloating. It said, we asked them to turn around. They did not turn around. That was all. 9 ships, and a sentence. And I sat at my station and moved the count in my ledger from 9 down to 0, and I understood that I was watching a subtraction that would not stop until someone in that chamber of 300 species learned to feel. I need you to understand how the humans took those 9 ships, because the manner of it mattered more than the fact. We recovered one of the cruisers, later, drifting powered and empty, and I went aboard it myself. Every system worked. The reactor hummed. The air was warm, and every crew member was simply gone, lifted off, taken, unharmed as far as we could ever determine, held somewhere and eventually, cycles later, returned. The humans had not slaughtered 9 crews. They had disarmed 9 ships, emptied them of their people, kept those people fed and whole, and sent the hulls back to us as a demonstration. It would have been easier to destroy them, cheaper, faster. The humans chose the harder mercy on purpose, because the point was never the killing. The point was to show us that the killing was a choice they were declining to make, over and over, so that when they finally described the war to their own children, it would not be a war of extermination, but a war of return. Everything they took, they gave away to give back. That is the discipline. I did not understand it yet. I only wrote the number down, 0. Viel's certainty developed its first crack that day. I saw it. He stood over the tactical display for a long time, and he said the old line again. A species that loses its cradle has lost its spine. But he said it to the empty air, the way a man says a prayer he has stopped believing, to see if the sound of it still works. It did not work. Behind him, Sevith and the other officer who had stopped breathing over the moon were now, I noticed, keeping their hands very still. It was during this stretch, when the silences were coming faster than I could contextualize them, that I first met Torvek. He was Vaughn, the Varn Dominion, in the years of the burning, had run the auction houses where human prisoners were sold after the siege of the Outer Worlds, sold openly, catalogued by strength and disposition, like beasts of labor. Torvek had been an officer of that dominion. And then one day he had cut the throat of his own commander, taken the routing keys of an entire slaving corridor, and delivered them into human hands. He wore human armor now, not as a costume, but as a debt. When I asked him, later, why he had turned, he did not say. Guilt, he said. I read your ledger before you ever wrote it. I saw what the humans were going to be, and I decided I would rather help build the thing that was coming than be standing in front of it. It was the most honest sentence anyone said to me during the whole of the war. I met him in the way that mattered, because he came looking for me. That should have frightened me, more than it did. A defector from the human fleet, crossing half a sector to find a low analyst on the enemy flagship, and his reason was simple. He had read my returned report, the one about consequence and intent, the one the Concord had refused to read. It had reached the humans somehow, the way things do, and Adaro had read it, and Adaro had said, "That one understands us. Find him." So Torvek found me, on a neutral station, over a table, and he did not try to recruit me. He tried to warn me. He said, "They are going to offer you a choice eventually, the humans, and when they do, you will already have made it, because a person who counts silences is a person who has already decided which side of the ledger he wants his name on." Then he told me about the quiet fleet. He did not tell me much. He told me it existed, that the ships we had seen, the Iron Vigil and her few sisters, were not the strength of humanity but the courtesy of it, the part they were willing to show. He said the humans had a habit, older than their spaceflight, older than their cradle's first cities, of building things too dangerous to use and then not using them on purpose as a discipline. He said the word discipline, the way you would say a holy word. And then he said the thing that kept me awake for a full rotation, that I have never fully put down since. He said, the terrifying thing about them is not what they will do to you. It is what they could do to you and choose not to. You will spend the rest of your life trying to understand a mercy you did not earn. I did not believe him. I wanted to, but belief is expensive, and I was not yet ready to pay. Then came the signal from Halvane's Reach, and after that I could not afford my doubt any longer. Halvane's Reach was a human colony that the Concord's own records listed as extinct, erased in the burning, memorialized, closed. 350 souls gone, and then threading up through the static of a dead sector, weak and broken and refusing to die. A signal. This is Halvane's Reach. We survived, requesting extraction, repeating on a cycle, every 6 hours, patient as the Iron Vigil above our moon, patient as a heartbeat that has decided it is not finished. I intercepted it before human ears did. That was my function, after all, to hear things first. And I sat with the decision for a long, ugly moment. Protocol required me to route it to Vael, who would have used it as bait, seeded the sector with mines, waited for the humans to come for their own, and killed them in the reaching. I knew this the way you know the weather. And I did a thing that ended my career in the Concord and began whatever I have been since. I let the signal pass. I did not flag it. I told my station it had heard nothing. My hands were not steady while I did it. I remember watching them not be steady and thinking, this is the moment. This is the one Torvek meant. You have already decided, and now you are only learning what you decided. The Iron Vigil reached Halvane's Reach 6 days later. I know because I followed the intercept traffic, unable to look away. The colony was a fractured ring spinning around a dead world. No power, no light, only that signal repeating in the cold. The humans boarded in full armor, not because they expected a fight, but because they did not know what grief would look like after all those years. And inside, in the dark, they found 57 people still alive. They did not cheer. This is the thing I keep returning to. The thing I put in my testimony later, when I stood before the very chamber that had laughed at me. The humans did not cheer when they found their lost. An engineer named Doss, who had kept 57 people breathing for years on a station that should not have held life, gripped Adaro's hand with fingers ruined by cold, and asked him one question. Did we matter? And Adaro, who could ask our weapons to miss and be obeyed, who commanded a fleet that had reduced 9 cruisers to a single quiet sentence, knelt down and took off his helmet and said, "You are the only thing that ever did." I heard that on my intercept, and I am not ashamed to tell you that I, an officer of the fleet sent to destroy them, wept at my station in the dark, and moved to a new page in my ledger and began to count something other than silences. I began to count the reasons. Doss was the one who gave the humans the warning that shaped everything after. He had recovered, over his years in the dark, a fragment of Keruvani military traffic, cracked at terrible cost, and he handed it to Adaro, along with his 57 souls. It took the humans no time at all to read it. It was a draft, a protocol, and when I finally saw it myself, through Torvek, I understood that the Concord had not been merely defending itself against the human strikes. The Concord had been preparing all along to finish what the Keruvani started. The Concord's answer to Haldane's reach was Edict 7. We called it the Ash Protocol. In the ready rooms, in the low voices officers use for the orders they will carry out and never defend. On its face, it was a directive. In its body, it was an extinction. Every human genome, every variant, every survivor and colonist and child, flagged under Concord law as an existential category, to be sanctioned without trial, without quarter, without the small mercy of a name. Torvek brought me the recovered draft before it was even ratified, pulled from a shattered Seruvani relay, 2 years in the cracking. He put the data slate in my hands, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. I read it. I read the clause that turned 350,000 living people into a hazard to be cleared. And I understood that we had made the humans' argument for them. We had taken the one thing they had left, the belief that they were fighting for the right to exist without our permission, and we had signed it into law. And there was worse in that draft than the clause, and I have to tell it, though I have never wanted to. Attached to Edict 7 as justification was a research annex. The Concord, or elements within it that the Concord chose not to see, had been studying the humans, not from a distance. They had taken human captives in the burning years, and they had held them, and they had tried to understand what made a death world species endure, so that it could be countered or bred or broken. Some of the captives were children. I read the annex once, and I have never read it again, and I will not describe it to you, because the describing is itself a kind of harm, and the humans, when they found the place where it happened, understood that better than I did. Because the humans did find it, following the same map of consequence they had walked from the start. They traced Edict 7 back to its research annex, back to a hidden facility in a nebula off every chart, and they went in. And here's the thing I need you to hold, the thing that is the whole difference between the humans and everything the Concord ever was. They found their children there, and they did not answer it in kind. They could have. Any species I have ever known would have. They walked through that facility, and they took every surviving captive out alive, the children first, wrapped and warmed and carried, and they removed the researchers from the place and held them for the reckoning that came later. A lawful reckoning, a named one, and they did not visit upon those researchers one fraction of what had been done in that facility. Because the humans had decided, somewhere in their long climb out of their own furnace, that you do not become the thing you are fighting, even when the thing you are fighting has earned every cruelty you could invent. One of the rescued, a girl no older than 7, told the human who carried her that they had said she was not a person. And the human said they were wrong and carried her out. And that was the whole of the human revenge, that a child was told she was a person and then treated like one. I put that in my testimony too. It is the sentence in it I am proudest of having been able to write. The Human War Council met after that. I did not see it, but I have pieced it together. From Torvek, from intercepts, from the shape of what came next. 20 commanders, scattered across 7 sectors, each carrying a burned world in their chest, gathered in one room. And Adaro laid Edict 7 on the table and let them read it. And when they were done, one of them, a commander named Illing, said a single word into the silence. Finally, not with joy, with the terrible relief of a person who has been told at last that the thing they suspected is true, and that they may now stop pretending otherwise. Another leaned forward and said, "This changes everything." And Adaro, who was always the calmest voice in any room, said, "No, it clarifies everything. I want you to sit with that distinction, the way I have. A lesser species, faced with a decree of its own extinction, becomes wild. It lashes. The humans became precise. Edict 7 did not enrage them. It focused them. It removed the last ambiguity from a picture they had been reading for years, and it left them holding a certainty as clean and cold as the vacuum. They would not negotiate, because the Concord had voted that there was nothing to negotiate. They would simply continue, patiently, target by target, silence by silence, until the fleet that had signed their death understood that it had signed its own. Not all of them agreed on the shape of it. This is a thing the Concord never guessed, and could never have guessed, because we imagined the humans as a single, furious will, and they were not. They argued. Torvek told me about a soldier named Marek, a veteran of the earliest strikes, who came to Adaro after the rescue of the children and said, "We are building a graveyard, not a future." He said, when the last Concord world goes quiet, what is left? And Adaro did not dismiss him. That was the thing. The commander who could empty 9 ships with a sentence stood and listened to a soldier tell him the war was becoming a wound, and he said, "We are what is left." And he meant it as an answer, and Marek took it as a warning. And both of them were right. The humans carried their own doubt into every strike. They never once let the war make the decision for them. Every restraint they showed against their own grief, which is the only kind of restraint that costs anything. The count in my ledger stood at 9 ships gone, and 100 small silences, and 1 colony brought back from the dead. And then the Concord, unable to win and unwilling to stop, did the most human thing it had ever done, though it did not know it. It got frightened, and it asked to talk. They called it a summit, a ceasefire, a neutral station named Ostrin, out on the edge of Concord space, white stone, floating inside a shimmering shell, dressed up to look like peace. Every human aboard the Iron Vigil knew it was a trap. Torvek knew. I knew. Viel, who had planned the trap, was almost gentle in his certainty that it would work, and I watched him plan it, and I felt the old cold return, because I had learned to distrust his certainty the way a sailor distrusts a calm sea, before a storm he can smell but cannot see. Adaro agreed to come. That was what none of us could parse. He agreed to walk into a room built to kill him. And when Torvek asked him why, on a channel I was not supposed to be able to hear but heard anyway, Adaro said only, "They still think we came to survive. Let them keep thinking it a little longer." He brought 10 of his people. No banners, no representatives. Black armor, heavy boots, and weapons they did not draw, which everyone in the chamber felt anyway. Torvek met him at the gates. "Still no insignia," he said. "Even now you carry no flag." And Adaro answered, "There is only one thing we carry." Torvek, who had turned his whole life over to understand these people, said, "Let me guess. Memory." And Adaro looked at him, the way you look at a loaded weapon that happens to be pointed the right way, and said nothing, and that was answer enough. The chamber was small. 12 species now, not 300. The Concord had contracted, the way a body contracts around a wound. The new High Arbiter was Nera, a female of that species, silver-limbed, robed in ceremony that had begun to smell of desperation. And her name was Senna. She welcomed the human delegation in a voice that trembled on the second word. "We acknowledge your retaliation," she said. "We acknowledge your pain. But surely you understand, this path cannot continue." Adaro did not sit at first. He walked to the center of the chamber, and he set something on the floor, and the room went still around it. It was a helmet, human, scorched black, the visor cracked across, and it had belonged to a woman named Terran Vess. I knew that name. I had put it in my ledger, in the early pages, when it was still just a phrase in a report, a fact I recorded and did not feel. Terran Vess had been a hydraulics engineer on the Quelis colonies. She had a daughter named Ella. When the Keruvani came down on Quelis with the Concord Silence for cover, Terran Vess had stayed at her station and kept the water running for the shelters, as long as there were shelters, and then a little longer, and her body was never recovered. Adaro set her helmet on the floor of that chamber and said, "This is what your peace looks like." No one spoke, and then he said, "The thing that I carried out of that room and have carried since." He said, "I want every one of you to remember this moment. When we come for your worlds, your ships, your archives, I want you to remember that you had a chance to end it, and you asked us instead to forget the water." She kept running. Senna's voice, when she found it, was almost a whisper. "Commander, what is it you want?" And Adaro looked at her. And he did not say vengeance, and he did not say territory, and he did not say apology. He said, "I want you to understand that we could take all of it, and that we are choosing in this room not to. Then he turned and walked out, and his 10 walked out behind him, and no weapon was drawn, and no shot was fired, and the trap that Vial had built closed on empty air. And then the trap consumed the ones who built it, and not by human hands. An hour after the humans left Ostron, the station's inner chamber breached from within. It was not the humans, it was one of the Concord's own, a delegate of the Vaan, who had sat through the whole summit with the annex of Edict 7 in his memory, and the sight of that human commander setting a dead woman's helmet on the floor, and who could not, in the end, carry both. He left a message before the breach. It was short, and it shook. They warned us, and we did not listen. I will not die with your guilt on my name. The blast killed 7 of the 12 delegates. The others survived, barely. And the humans did not claim it because it was not theirs to claim, and they did not need to, because the galaxy claimed it for them. The story went out across Concord space in less than a day. The humans came to talk. The Concord laid a trap, and one of the Concord's own chose to die with honor, rather than live inside what the Concord had become. That was the moment the frightened dozen began to fracture into a frightened one, each species now measuring the distance between itself and the humans and finding no cover anywhere in the math. I need to tell you what the humans did next, because it is the center of everything, and it is the part that broke Vial for good. And it is the part that no member of the Concord has ever been able to explain to their own children. They did not spring the trap in reverse. They did not slaughter what was left of the delegation. They had every reason to. Instead, in the days after Ostron, the Iron Vigil and her sisters moved against the Vaan Dominion. The slavers, the ones who had sold human prisoners like livestock. And they did not burn the Dominion. They went to the auction worlds, the labor camps, the corridors where sentient beings of a dozen species were held as property, and they opened them, every cage, every hold. They freed the slaves of the very empire that had once sold their own people, and they did not ask the freed to swear anything, and they did not garrison the worlds, and they did not raise a single flag over the wreckage of the Dominion's shame. They simply unlocked the doors and left. The Vaan survivors sent an envoy to the Concord, in a state near madness. "This is not how war works," the envoy kept saying. "This is not how war works. You do not win a war and give the winnings to strangers. You do not free your enemy's slaves and ask for nothing." It broke something in him to have seen it. And I sat, listening to his report, and I finally understood what Torvik had tried to tell me. The terror of the humans was not the fleet or the vanishing ships or the quiet trick that made our weapons miss. The terror was the mercy, because a species that will not be bought, that takes the spoils of its victory and hands them to the powerless, is a species you cannot bargain with, cannot corrupt, cannot frighten. There is no leverage on a people who have already decided what they will not become. Among the freed, on one of the Vaan labor worlds, the humans found the ritual archive of an old Keruvani house, seized generations back as tribute and half forgotten in a Vaan vault. Ceremonial objects, blades, the kind of thing a species keeps to know who it is. And the humans, who could have melted it all for the insult it represented, catalogued it instead, gently, and set it aside. And I did not understand why, until much later, when I saw what they did with it. They were keeping it to give back. Even in the middle of a war of extinction, they were already building the peace, one returned object at a time, because the humans understood, a thing the Concord in all its marble reason never grasped, which is that you cannot end a war by winning it. You can only end it by giving the loser a way to remain themselves. The count in my ledger changed shape that day. The silences were no longer 9 ships and 100 stations. Word had reached me, from Torvik, from intercepts, from the panic on the Concord's own channels, that the human fleet was larger than the ships we had seen. Not 9, not a squadron of quiet raiders. 600 vessels held in reserve across the outer dark, built and crewed and waiting, and never once committed, because the humans had never needed to commit them. Everything we had suffered, they had done with a fraction of themselves. I wrote the number down. 600! And I felt the specific vertigo of a person who realizes he has been fighting a shadow and calling it the whole. There was a world called Sarath, and I have to tell you what the humans did there because it is the beat where the Concord finally understood that it did not know what kind of enemy it had, and it is the beat I return to on the nights when I doubt whether any of it happened the way I remember. Sarath was not a fortress. It held no fleet worth the name. It was the Teruvani Senate world, the place where, generations before the burning, the first embargo against humanity had been voted into law, where a chamber of comfortable delegates had looked at a young species climbing out of its furnace and voted to name it a hazard and shut the doors. It was, in every sense, that mattered to the humans. The room where it all began. And it was undefended. When the Iron Vigil and her sisters appeared over Sarath, the world emptied. The delegates fled first, as delegates always do. The fleet garrison abandoned its posts. Ships lifted in a panic that lit the upper atmosphere. Everyone certain that the humans had come at last to make the example the Concord would have made, to turn the birthplace of the embargo into a lesson written in fire. And the humans sent down one figure, not a fleet, not a bombardment. Osric, alone. The Guardian walked the emptied Senate world by himself, and I watched the feet of it from Vale's own bridge. And the whole staff watched, and no one breathed, waiting for the world to come apart under him. It did not come apart. Here is what Osric did on Sarath, alone, in the place where humanity was first condemned. He walked into the abandoned Senate chamber, the actual room, the seat still warm from the fled delegates, and he did not tear it down. He stood in it for a long moment, this remade thing that could have leveled the continent. And then he did two things. He left on the floor of that chamber a single record, not a threat. The names of the human dead of Coelis, every one the humans had been able to recover, Taran Vess among them, laid in the exact place where the vote had been cast that made their deaths lawful. And then he went down into the world's failing systems, because the fleeing Concord had abandoned Sarath's civilian population, along with its Senate, cut the power in their panic, left the ordinary people of that world to suffocate in the dark for the crime of living where their leaders had voted. And Osric, the weapon the humans built for the end of everything, spent his hours on Sarath not destroying the birthplace of the embargo, but repairing its life support, restoring the air and the water and the light to the millions of ordinary beings the Concord had left to die. He saved the world that had condemned his species, and he left it its names to remember. And then he walked back up to the ship and said nothing, and the feed cut, and on Viel's bridge, no one could look at anyone else. That was the message, not the carved threat the Concord expected. A restored world and a list of the dead. The humans had taken the room where they were first called a hazard, and instead of proving the Concord right, they had proved it wrong in the only language that cannot be argued with, which is the language of what you actually do when you finally have your enemy at your mercy. Sarath told the galaxy everything Ostron had not. It said, we could and we will not, and the not is the whole of who we are. It was around this time that the payoff of Taran Vess finally landed on me. Weeks after the helmet and the quiet way the humans intend such things, I found in a captured Teruvani archive an image, a workshop on Quilis before the burning, a woman at a bench and beside her a small child with the same set to the jaw and a cup of something gone cold at the edge of the frame, forgotten in the middle of a life that assumed it had more time. Taran and Ella Vess. I looked at the empty cup for a long time. That is how the humans make you feel it. Not with the burning, with the cup. With the ordinary thing left mid-motion, that says a person was here, planning to come back, and did not. I closed the archive and I did not open it again. And I understood, finally, why Adaro had brought her helmet and not a weapon into the summit. A weapon says, look what I can do to you. A helmet says, look what you have already done and cannot undo, and I have chosen not to make you unable to undo anything ever again. The helmet was the mercy and the accusation in one object. I have never seen a species wield grief that precisely. Vial said the old line, one more time, in front of the full staff. The week the Varn slaves were freed. A species that loses its cradle has lost its spine. But there was nothing behind it now. It was a shape his mouth made. And Sevith, the young officer who had stopped breathing over the moon, said quietly, with a courage I did not know he had, "Then why are we the ones losing?" Vial did not answer. He could not. And I understood that the Grand Marshal, who had never lost a battle in 400 cycles, had lost this one somewhere. Back at the beginning, in a chamber built on marble, when he decided that a grieving species was a weak one and that he could tell the difference between the two by looking. The Concord recalled us to Halvane for a full accounting. And I, analyst Vaeon of the Osse, whose speculation had once exceeded his clearance, was called at last to speak, not as a witness for the fleet, as the only officer who had read it right from the start. I stood in the chamber where they had laughed at me. Fewer of them now. The 300 species had become a frightened dozen, and the marble looked less like reason and more like a mausoleum, which is what Adaro had called Ostrin, and which I now understood applied to the whole of what we had built. High Arbiter Senna asked me to explain what the fleet had failed to explain, which was simply this. How does a species we broke, whose world we let die, come back and take the galaxy apart without ever raising its voice? So I told them what I had learned, and I will tell you, because you should know it too. The humans came from a world that tried to kill them every day of their long climb. Not a garden, a furnace. Predators, plagues, weather that could unmake a settlement in an afternoon. They did not evolve toward comfort. They evolved toward endurance and toward one another, and toward a hard practical genius for surviving the thing that was currently trying to end them. That is the death world discipline. It is not aggression. Aggression is cheap and every species has it. It is the capacity to keep functioning calmly, competently, after the worst thing has already happened. We looked at a people whose cradle had burned, and we saw the worst thing. They looked at the same fire and saw only the latest thing. One more furnace in a species that had never known any other kind of home. And then I told them the part that emptied the chamber of its last certainty. Because the humans had not only survived their furnace, somewhere in the deep of their history, before their spaceflight, before the Concord had a name, they had found something. Torvek called it the Cairn Initiative, and its site was a place the humans named Cairn Deep, buried on a lightless world at the edge of a system that appears on no Concord chart. And what was buried there was power. I had been permitted by then to see it. That is a thing I still cannot fully believe, that the humans allowed an officer of the fleet that hunted them to walk into the heart of their oldest secret. But they did, because Adaro had decided that the peace would need a witness. The Concord could not accuse of loyalty to the humans, and I was that witness. Torvek took me down into Cairn Deep. It is a structure shaped like a blade, driven into the earth of a dead world. And the deeper you go, the colder and older it becomes. And at the bottom of it, there are chambers the humans built in an age when they were staring at the possibility of their own extinction, and had asked themselves what they would make if they were willing to make anything. What they made were guardians. The first of them was called Osric. He was human once, and then he was more than human, remade in that desperate age into something that did not need food or rest or fear. Something that could stand alone against a fleet and end it. And when I say I saw him, I mean I stood in a cold chamber and watched a pod open and a figure taller than any human step out of it. Armor grown into skin, eyes like still black water, and I felt the whole weight of my species' error settle onto me at once, because Osric did not move like a weapon. He moved like a man who had studied death for a very long time and decided at the end of the study to be careful with it. His first words, when they woke him, were not a demand to kill. They were a question. Is there still a chain of command? And when they told him there was, he said, "Then I need orders." And he waited for them, this being that could have unmade the Concord alone. He waited patiently for a human of ordinary size to tell him what was permitted. That is the leash. The humans did not build the leash into Osric. Osric is the leash. The restraint is not imposed on the Guardian from outside. It is what the Guardian is. I asked him one thing, through Torvek, because I could not stop myself. I asked, why did you stop in the old war, the one that made you? Why did your kind refuse the orders that came in the end? And Osric looked at me with those still black eyes and said, we did not stop. We waited. And I asked, waited for what? And he said, the right war. And then he said, the thing that I have never been able to set down, the thing that is the whole of the human secret in 6 words. He said, and this is not it. This war, the one that had taken the Concord apart, the one that had emptied 9 ships and freed the Varn slaves and brought a dead colony back from the cold. This was not, to the Guardian humanity built for the end of everything, even the war worth waking fully for. The humans had woken Osric and 2 others and no more, and they had kept them leashed, and they had won without ever letting the leash go slack, because the thing the humans were most afraid of was not the Concord. It was themselves, unrestrained. They had seen once, long ago, in the age that built Cairn Deep, what they became when they stopped choosing, and they had buried the proof of it and posted a guard over it, made of their own most disciplined dead, so that they would never forget the price of the thing they were capable of. And beneath Cairn Deep, deeper than the Guardians, there was one thing more, and I only glimpsed the edge of it. And I will only tell you the edge. The humans call it the Origin Vault, and what sleeps in it they call the Loom. It is older than the humans, older than the cradle, something they found in their infancy, half dead and still humming, buried in the bones of their own solar system, a power that did not belong to them and that they never fully understood. And the entire history of the human species, every war and mercy and silence can be told as one long decision about the Loom, which is the decision not to wake it. They found the oldest and most dangerous thing in the reach of any living species in the first hour of their climb, and they have spent every hour since choosing again and again across 10,000 years not to use it. That is what we called volatile. That is the species we called too broken to rise. The number I had been counting became something I could barely hold. Not 9 ships, not 600. What Cairn Deep implied, the reserve beneath the reserve, ran to 18,000, and I say that number knowing it is only the part the humans admitted to, and knowing that they held all of it in check every day as a matter of ordinary practice. We had feared them for the ships we could see. We should have knelt for the ships we could not, and for the Guardians beneath the ships, and for the Loom beneath the Guardians. And most of all, for the fact that a species holding all of that had chosen, when we burned its cradle and signed its extinction and studied its children, to answer us with returned hulls and freed slaves and a dead woman's helmet set gently on a marble floor. I said, to the chamber, the sentence I had been building toward my whole career, the one I still believe. A species is not defined by the power it holds. Every fool holds power eventually. A species is defined by the power it refuses. And the humans have refused more than the Concord has ever possessed. The chamber did not applaud. There is no applause for being told that your enemy has always been your better. But Senna looked at me, and then she looked at the human delegation, seated at the edge of the chamber, quiet as they always were. And she asked to speak with Commander Adaro alone, and Vale, the Grand Marshal, old and gray and undone, asked for the same thing. Not to negotiate. He had nothing to negotiate with. He asked to sit across from the man who had beaten him, and to ask him the one question that had been eating the certainty out of him since the moon. And Adaro, in his mercy, said yes. I was permitted to be present because by then I was the bridge, the only officer both sides trusted, though neither would have said so aloud. Vael sat across from Adaro in a bare room, an old defeated soldier and a calm one, and he asked it. Why didn't you destroy us? You had the ships. You had the Guardians. You had the thing beneath the Guardians. You emptied our fleets and returned the crews. You freed the slaves of the Dominion that sold your people. You returned the ritual blades of my own house that we did not even know you had taken. And you asked for nothing. Why? And there was, in the old marshal's voice, no bitterness anymore. Only the exhaustion of a mind that has finally admitted it does not understand the shape of the world it has lived in. Adaro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because we know what it costs. Not to win. Anyone can win if they are willing to become the thing that wins that way. We know what it costs to become that thing because we came within one bad decade of becoming it ourselves, and we have kept the proof of it sleeping in the dark for 10,000 years so that we would never forget the price. You wanted us to lose our spine when we lost our cradle. We did not lose our spine. We lost our cradle, and we chose, in the fire, not to lose ourselves. That is the only victory that was ever worth anything, and you cannot have it by winning. You can only have it by refusing." And then Adaro did the human thing, the small thing that carries all the weight, the thing our species will be trying to understand for 1,000 years. He set on the bare table between them the ritual blade of Vale's house, the last of them, the one the humans had found in the Van vault and catalogued and kept. He returned it to the enemy in defeat. A blade the humans could have kept as a trophy or destroyed as a message, and instead they gave it back because it was not theirs, and because giving it back said, more clearly than any fleet, that the war was over and they had not become monsters to end it. Viel took the blade in both hands and could not speak. And then, in the only gesture of grace I ever saw him make, he laid it back down on the table and pushed it a small distance toward Adaro and said, "Keep it then, not as a trophy, but as the only witness left to what my house was before it forgot itself." And Adaro looked at the old marshal for a long moment and did not take it and did not refuse it, and simply left it there in the space between them, which is where it remains, in a case at the edge of the human sphere, belonging to neither of them. A blade two enemies could not bring themselves to keep or destroy, which is, I have come to think, the truest shape a peace can take. I closed my ledger that day. I had been counting silences since the first hour, and the silences had run all the way down. 9 to 0 and 100 stations and a burned cradle. And I had waited the whole war to write the last one. But I did not write a silence at the end. I wrote something else, because in the weeks after Halvane, the silences reversed. The dark worlds that had stopped answering the Concord began, one by one, to answer again. Not out of loyalty and not out of fear, but because a peace had come that no one had conquered and everyone could live inside. The relays lit. The corridors opened. The frightened dozen species became 100 again, and then more, and this time no one was quarantined, and no envoy was expelled, and no cradle was allowed to burn, while a chamber of reason voted to table the question. The last entry in my ledger is not a silence. It is a count of worlds learning, again, to speak. The humans did not rule any of it. That is the part I want you to carry. If you carry nothing else. They had the ships and the guardians and the loom sleeping beneath the guardians, and they wanted none of it. They took no seat they had not earned, and they claimed no world, and when the treaties floated through the chambers, like uncertain ghosts, the humans simply listened, because they had learned long ago that power does not come from noise. It comes from stillness, and there is nothing in the reach of any species more still than a people who could take everything and have decided, watching you whether you deserve to keep it. Marek, the soldier who had told Adaro they were building a graveyard, spoke at the first remembrance after the war. Before the wall of names the humans etched into black stone, above what remained of one of their lost worlds. He was older by then, his voice worn down to gravel by everything it had carried. He said only 6 words. "We were never supposed to win." Then he walked away, and no one followed, because nothing more needed saying. And I have thought since that he was both right and wrong in the way. Only a human can be both at once. They were never supposed to win by every law of the galaxy as the Concord understood it. And they won anyway, and the winning did not make them the thing the winning usually makes of a people. And that, precisely that, was the victory, not the survival. the staying human through the survival. Osric stands guard now at the edge of the human sphere, at cairn deep above the sleeping loom. Not to threaten, to remember. The humans keep him leashed and awake, a guardian over the worst thing they ever built and the older thing they refuse to wake, so that no one, human or otherwise, will ever again mistake restraint for weakness or a grieving people for a broken one. Viel visits him once a cycle, they tell me. The old marshal and the guardian. Two things that were made for war and outlived their reasons. I do not know what they say to each other. I do not think they say much. Some understandings do not need words. Sevith, the young officer who felt the fear early and lived, serves now on the bridge I keep between the humans and the rest of us, and he is not young anymore, and neither am I, and neither of us has ever once been laughed at again for saying the thing that turned out to be true. The children the humans carried out of the nebula live now in orbit above a quiet world, and they build ships that are not weapons, and they write books instead of reports, and they ask questions, not for revenge, but for understanding. Sometimes I watch them from the outer platforms, and none of them know my name, and that is exactly as it should be, because it means we did the work, and the work does not need to be remembered by its doer. The humans never wanted to be heroes. They told me that, more than once, in more than one voice. We were meant to be a warning, Adaro said to me near the end. And warnings do not wear medals, they wear scars. And I look at the scars of the human sphere, the etched names and the leashed guardian and the blade, in the case that belongs to no one, and I understand that a scar is only a wound that chose to keep living, and that the humans are the most scarred and most living thing the galaxy has ever held. As for me, I am Vayan still, of the Osai, and I am no longer low-ranked, though I have never learned to enjoy being high. I keep the bridge open between the humans and the rest of us, and I tell this story wherever a young officer is about to make the mistake I watched a whole Concord make. When they laugh, and some of them still laugh, I let them. Then I tell them the one thing that is true, the thing I would have given my whole career to have understood on the day I stood in that chamber and was not believed. A species that loses its cradle has not lost its spine. It has learned exactly what it is willing to become, and chosen in the fire to become something you will never be able to buy or break or frighten. Do not make them remember what that is, because they will show you, quietly, and the galaxy will have no words left for it. Only a single word, carved a kilometer deep, where you will have to keep looking at it for the rest of the long peace they were generous enough to give you. Mercy. They wrote it on our moon before they wrote it on the whole of the sky. I was there. I counted every silence between, and when the last one turned back into a voice, I finally understood that the humans had never been asking to survive us at all. They had been deciding whether we deserved to survive them. And they decided, against every reason we had given them, that we did. That is the story. That is what remains. When the fires burn out and the fleets stand down and the stars fall quiet. Not the conquest. Not the vengeance we expected and did not receive. Only a leashed guardian at the edge of the dark, and a blade returned to no one's hands, and a species that could have been our ending. Standing watch instead so that we could learn, slowly, in the long light of a mercy we did not earn, to become something a little more like them. There are worse things a broken galaxy could be given than the patience of the people it once tried to erase. We were given that patience. We did nothing to deserve it. We had earned, by every honest measure, the ending we expected, and we received instead a beginning we could not have imagined and did not ask for, and we are still here, speaking, gathered again into more worlds than the Concord ever held. Because of a decision made by a species we tried to erase, which is the only argument I have ever needed for the thing I told them at the beginning and will tell them until I am silent for good. Do not touch the humans, not because you will lose, because if you are very fortunate, they will let you lose, and then they will show you how to be more than you were, and you will spend the rest of your life trying to become worthy of the mercy of the species you called to broken to rise.